goes into the minutes.
Okay. So, do you want it to go in the minutes?
Yes. We're just about ready to start, but I wanted to just turn the floor over to Beverly for a special announcement.
Yes, behind every Auditor General, actually behind every leader, there's a number of people who make things happen. And you saw a few of the people today. I like to empower my staff, and they came forth, and I was very proud today. I'm also very proud of somebody who's retiring from the city after 32 years, Akrivi Nicolau. And Akrivi has worked in transportation and tech services, and then she came to our office with a wealth of experience. And she's leaving on a high. She was the person who transformed the follow-up process for us. So I just have a small gift of appreciation to Akrivi to thank her on behalf of my entire office and this committee. So thank you, Akrivi.
I would have said this afterwards.
So it's open mic, right?
Use the open mic night at the Audit Committee. No, I thought I'd use this time while we're waiting for quorum to be met rather than taking time later I've said this before at this committee, and I'll say it again in this context. At the beginning of my first term, after I was elected in 2010, I was forcibly put on this committee under duress by Mayor Rob Ford. And I think it was because of the way that we were like-minded in so many ways that he felt that I would be appropriate for a committee that he chose me for. And once I was here, I found it to be, rather than something that I was forced to be on, one of the most interesting, rewarding, and important committees that I could have been appointed to. You know, I've said this before, how there was a lot of rhetoric around, you know, the gravy train and cutting costs and finding efficiencies. But if you substantively want to learn how to make government run better and find ways to make it run more efficiently, this is the committee to come to. So therefore, we could run a better city. So I've found this committee wonderfully, and I've enjoyed working with both the former AG as I do with you. And I also want to acknowledge the chair. Stephen Holliday, Stephen, you've run this committee in the most respectful, civil, effective, and positive way that I could imagine a chair chairing a committee. And it's just been a genuine honor and privilege to serve with you, as it has been with all of my committee members.
Thank you, Councillor Matlow, and I just want to say we got a great bunch here, and I really appreciate everyone's work. With that, I want to be mindful with time, and I thank you for what you had to say. I mean, it was positive. Let's call this meeting back to order and get back to AU 13.19, Auditor General's 2018 Status Report on Outstanding Audit Recommendations for City Agencies and Corporations. Councillor Matlow, you had asked questions. I just want to ask if there's any other members of the committee that wish to ask questions on this matter. Seeing no, Councillor Matlow, did you wish to speak on this?
No, I just want to ask this question.
Excellent. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to adopt the recommendations in the report. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. AU 13.20. Auditor General's Office report on the results of applying specified auditing procedures to financial information other than financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2017. Councillor Hart, you had held that item.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm not sure who can answer it. It's with regard to the Gore letter. On the appendix, there's a list of annual non-competitive procurement activity. And there's 6 items that have been redacted, the names of the vendors. And the reason is Section 181 of the City of Toronto Act, which the Section 181 of the City of Toronto Act talks about secrecy and personal information. I'm not so sure that it applies to the names of vendors. So my question is, why are vendors' names redacted?
Very kind, and thank you for the question. And through you, Chair, that is required, in my view, under the confidentiality provisions. You wouldn't find, many Auditor Generals use experts, but they don't disclose who they use, and it really depends on the case that you're working on. If you're working on a forensic matter, for instance, it can be that pressure can be brought to bear on the consultant that's working on potentially only one aspect of the work. The other thing is the report is my report. It's not the report of the consultant. So I do find from time to time when some people don't agree with the findings, trying to understand exactly who helped with the report to potentially bring pressure to bear. And so it's not uncommon that Auditor Generals don't disclose who their experts are. We are required to qualify our experts under our accounting provisions. So in fact, if I was asked to disclose the vendors, I would actually not do it, and it would have to be a provincial matter brought to court because it is required that they remain confidential.
One quick follow-up question. So would any of these vendors appeared before committee to give any kind of evidence? Would they have been public in that regard or not?
It depends on the case, and it depends on what I need. There was one matter where a vendor did come to committee, but sometimes they don't. So it really depends on what I need, and it's part of my evidentiary responsibility to make sure that I have the experts here if I need them, and so sometimes they appear, sometimes they don't, but it's for me to determine when they need to remain confidential.
Thank you. Anyone wishing to speak on this matter? Seeing none, I would propose that we adopt the recommendations or adopt the report. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. Okay, we're going to go back to the last remaining item, which is AU 13.11. and that is raising the alarm, fraud investigation of a vendor providing life safety inspection services to the City of Toronto. I have here a presentation from the Auditor General Beverly Romeo Beeler and Elaine Au.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll begin the presentation. And I'm going to start with actually the picture on the front. I put that picture there not to inflame a situation. I put that picture there because I honestly believe it's really time to be aware of what needs to be done to bring, I guess, buildings into compliance, and it's really a health and safety matter. So I wanted to make sure that there was attention brought to this issue. I'm going to start with an outline of the presentation, a little bit about the background, the fraud investigation process, our inspection and results, and we did have trouble when we were going through this process, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about how management did a bit of work as part of the process, and we did some work, and then our findings, and then some recommendations. So this is important because it involves our life safety systems. And I choose that term because that's the term under the National Building Code. And it relates to not only fire systems, but any system that's involved with people leaving buildings as a result of emergencies. It can be lighting, it can be emergency generators, it can be fire alarms. Also, I found that this contractor, a lot of people were aware of this contractor. The Canadian Fire Alarm Association was aware, other municipalities were aware, we were aware, and I just thought because this contractor started to continually morph companies and continue to do work in the way he was, that the city should be broadly aware, the City of Toronto, our corporation, should be broadly aware so that other divisions can make sure that they don't do business with this contractor if he's not performing to the level he should. It also opens a conversation because this is an area where there have been findings in this area, and I'm speaking with the fire chief and the deputy fire chief who's here today, Jim Jessup. This is an area where they feel the City of Toronto can assist with leading the province and support the Ontario Fire Marshal to bring about change. So a complaint came in May 21st, and it related to 3 companies, and those companies were York Fire, Advanced Fire, and Advanced Fire Detection Technologies Corp., and all of these were associated with one individual. And the allegation was that the company was overcharging and charging for work not done. And they alleged that there was somebody inside the city who was aware of the challenges with this company and that the work wasn't being done. And the complainant was wondering if the issue had been rectified. And the complainant also brought forth and named other municipalities who had dealt with this contractor and found that there were issues with performance and had let this contractor go. So on June 2nd, the complainant came back and gave more information. Now, I didn't have all of this information in the very beginning, but he talked to PMMD, that's our purchasing group, and he explained that this is a health and safety issue related to the city because if the fire alarms weren't working, or if the extinguishing systems weren't working, or if the emergency lighting system wasn't working, there could be a concern. So, and he explained that the company was not doing the tests that it said it was completing. So, and he also alleged at that time that there were technicians, the company was forging the names of technicians on, technician names on documents. So as by way of background, I just want to go through a life safety system. I've already spoken a little bit about it. We're familiar with it in smoke detectors, sprinklers, fire pumps. A lot is in the life safety system. And, you know, constantly we go back to inquiries, and inquiries say, you know, this inquiry from Weber, it talked about a failure to enforce the fire code as an impediment for firefighters doing their job. And improper functioning of the safety equipment exacerbates fire situations. And essentially, we are asking our force, our best, to go into a burning building and to address the situation there. And in some cases, you know, look at the rooming house, to carry out dead bodies. I mean, there's times I was on the phone with Deputy Chief And he was just finishing dealing with a very tragic situation. So we're asking our staff to go through. So we have a role here, and our role is to do our part. And that is to make sure at least the systems that are required to be in place are in place. And it comes down to a checklist, and this is absolutely oversimplifying the situation. Anybody who's involved with these types of things know that there are standards that go behind this. But essentially, weekly, monthly, I feel that online I have seen good checklists that show what has to be checked weekly, what has to be checked monthly. It's from an auditor's perspective, it's a very methodical checklist that has to go through. I know that Lou DiGeronimo in the water sector has a lot of compliance that he has to go through, and there's a very, very methodical checklist, and there's checklist on checklist. But this is what has to be done as part of the code. Everybody has to go through it and make sure that it's done. So roles and responsibilities are important. I think the biggest question I would have is, isn't it Toronto Fire's responsibility? It isn't. It's the building owner's responsibility. And the building owner contracts with vendors. And we often, when we contract out, think out of sight, out of mind. Perhaps if they are the specialists that we hire. In fact, when I started this work, I thought the people coming in were the specialists in the area. And what I realized was that they might not be, and we can't trust everybody. So the Toronto Fire Services is almost like an auditor general. They look at what the owner does, and they look at what the vendor does, and they make an independent determination on whether they are complying with the code. But also they have a dual responsibility of reporting to the city, to the deputy city managers, to the manager, city manager. But I looked in the Fire Prevention and Protection Act, and there is a responsibility for the fire chief to ultimately report to council. So I'm putting that there. It was in my report, and it's really for city council to determine what they want that role to look like going forward. It might be fine the way it is today. There might be some discussion there. So Toronto Fire really has a dual role. And the qualifications and licensing. So I also thought when I started this work that people had to be qualified, and what I realized is only fire alarms have a qualification, along with smoke detectors that are connected and sprinklers. Just when we started our work, sprinkler qualifications came into play. But for other things like making sure somebody checks the lighting or checks the generators, there's other extinguishing systems, the qualifications aren't specified, and that might be an area that the Ontario Fire Marshal might work. So this gives you a background of who we're talking about. 3 companies that we saw, there were more when we got into it, but essentially Advanced Fire Control had been doing work with the city, looking at fire alarms, sprinkler systems, fire extinguishers, and hydrostatic testing. And York Fire had some sprinkler contracts. They also had fire hydrants, emergency lighting, and fire alarm. And Advanced Detection Technologies were actively bidding on both the fire alarm and the sprinkler and the lighting. And they were bidding on, actively bidding on contracts, but they weren't successful in obtaining those contracts. And this is the process. So we have 1,000 allegations at committee every year. And what I do when I don't think that there is a conflict of interest, I allow management to take a first-line review. And many times they understand that they have a separate team and they have a look. And essentially they look, and in this case I asked them to look because they were the major user of the service. Did we get the service? And you know, was there any information to suggest that they didn't? And management usually conducts the first line. They report back to me, and at that point I make a decision whether I want to peel that onion back deeper, whether I want to go to the next layer and the next layer. And what I decide to do and how deep I decide to go depends on the risk. And so if the risk is high, be it that I think somebody might be involved or that the topic is risky, the level of work has to be balanced with that. And that's how auditors evaluate risk and decide what to do. And so then I started to conduct our work. And what I did was the allegations involved multiple private buildings, provincial buildings. It also involved city buildings. So I separated out, and independently, the Toronto Fire Service looks at private buildings. I don't have the jurisdiction to go in and audit a contractor in a private building. But in the public buildings, in the city buildings, we undertook an investigation, and also we asked Toronto Fire Service to do a little bit of work, and I'll explain the work that they did for us. Management did their work. They went away, they looked at the invoices, they talked to their people, they decided that there was no indication of mishandling, and that no invoices were paid unless there was an inspection report provided. And they matched things up. And so they did mention that there might be some packing slips missing, there might be some service reports missing, and that can be common in any organization we go into. You might have some things missing. And so we didn't expect it to be 100%, but I wanted to get assurance that what we paid for and that the work was done, and that the work was done. And so management talked about a three-way match process. So at the city, that process is that we make sure that the bills that come in are matched to a service. In this case, it would be an inspection report. We hired you to do an inspection, you did an inspection, everything is done, you sign the report. So this is the part of the three-way match process that we were looking for. And management didn't find anything, but at the same first meeting with management, what I identified was, I had been doing some background research, and logically I went into some of the metadata on the site behind the pictures, and I could see that they were tied to some stock photos. And then I started to look at other sites using Google Image to find where these images were. And I mentioned to them at that meeting that there were multiple stock photos on different sites for different things, for attorney sites and risk investment sites. So, I think the discussion at that point was, management had said, just because there's a stock photo doesn't mean it's a fraud. And I said, well, if he's on multiple sites doing multiple things and he signed the contract, Dave Daniels, maybe it is more of a fraud. And so it turned out Dave Daniels had signed that contract. We found out in that meeting, so I went off and started to do a deeper dive on my stuff. And so here's the stock photos with multiple sites, and you'll see Dave Daniels and Dave Williams are a common name. In fact, what I found in this contractor, when you're looking at matters related to a potential fraud, if people have to make things up, they tend to make things up in patterns, or they tend to find patterns in a system. And what I found was there's multiple times of first names used, like Jason Peters, Dave Daniels, David Williams. Multiple times, those were the kinds of names I would see. And so from looking at the situation from the get-go, it just raised my interest to look further. So I had 3 lines of inquiry. First, I wanted to make sure the bidding was legitimate. Next, I wanted to look at the inspections to make sure they were complete. And there's 2 prongs to that. Looking at the invoices and discussing with staff, but also to ensure completeness, just getting a sample to see if the work was actually done. I'm not qualified to do this. I asked for Deputy Fire Chief Jessup and his team, the Toronto Fire team, and actually it was the chief, Matt Pegg, who dedicated the resources to this, to go in and have a look at some buildings just to make sure that the inspections were done. And I just independently let that go. And then I undertook myself company searches with my team, Elaine Au, the director in the forensic unit, and we were a tag team on this. So my first line of inquiry was the bid review. What I noticed was that York Fire and Advanced Detection Technologies, there were 2 companies that were complained about were bidding on the same contract. And then I looked at the signatures. And although they were different names to these signatures on 2 different contracts, the writing to me, just untrained eye, looked to be similar to me. So it raised a question. Now, some people might think bid rigging. Well, you can't bid rig with yourself. So if it's the same person signing the contracts, it's not 2 different parties coming together. It's kind of funny the way the law works in that way. So he was bid rigging with himself. And so he put a bid in for $259,000 and a bid in for $94,000. And of course, the $94,000 won. And then I noticed different names on the different reports to be, as I mentioned, unusual. So then I went to the invoices, and I expected to find what management had told me, which was that the supporting documentation was there. And for Toronto Fire, we found most of the supporting documentation. There was issues within the documentation, but we could find some support for all. But I couldn't find the documentation for the facilities management. There's 52% that we could find, so 48% of it was missing. And we looked, and we looked, and we looked. And that was from July until November, and then we went back to management. They assured us that when they follow the process, they receive an invoice, they get the goods received, supervisor signs, it's paid. There might be some things missing. Still couldn't find the invoices. Unbeknownst to us, Toronto Fire Service was actually conducting the work we had asked them to do, was look at a couple of buildings, and they had similar challenges getting the documentation from facilities management, and really finding the inspection report, that inspections were done, and finding the inspection reports. Toronto Fire Services independently did its review of the private buildings as it was doing work on some of the work we were doing. And it came back and said to senior management that advanced fire control was not, had some issues, and this is the letter that was there, the note that was there, and it was basically, they thought that maybe there's some violations and inspections, and he warned the city to be careful in doing the contracting, and the city was careful. They had ended, then the city had ended the contract. But this was an important piece of information, because what it shows is if there's violations, that might mean the work is not being done. That might mean the inspection reports are not in order. That might mean there's a risk, and so that would be relevant to my audit. But I didn't get this actually in December until actually I found out in May. So I kept going with my work. Toronto Fire reported back on the work that it had done for us. It reported to senior management to say there were significant challenges in obtaining the documentation. And in their mind, it didn't appear that the third parties were actually carrying out the work in the way that they needed to do. There was a lot of documentation missing. And actually, Deputy Chief Jessup is here today if there's further questions. But there's documentation missing, and the documentation that was there was not complete. Some significant tests were not performed. By February, the deputy chief had noted that it was his recommendation to notify me about potential wrongdoing. And if the city didn't notify me, that he would do that, because he was concerned that it was more than one company at this point in time. That more than one company may not be doing the work. In fact, it doesn't mean that they weren't doing the work. It could mean that the system is broken. But either way, there's a mismanagement, or there's something going on. He tweaked that, he left it with management, and then continued on with his work. I wasn't informed of that. So I kept looking for invoices. So by March, I sat down with management again. By this time, I hired a forensic audit firm to work with me to find these invoices that were supposed to be there. We were spending some time to look for those. And management said, we wanted to meet with the managers, actual managers, not the directors, but the actual managers, to find out directly from them what was going on. At this point in time, I don't know if this management is involved, because all I know is they tell me the documentation is there, and I can't find it. So I'm trying to discern what's going on. And a note was sent out to managers that they have been very clear before the meeting, letting them know that senior management was very clear with the auditors that they follow the three-way match process. Well, it wasn't working. How could the process be followed? You know that you couldn't find the documents. You know that the deputy fire chief couldn't find the documents. You know there are violations, and I'm trying to find the documents. So I was concerned about this note. And then what happened, management actually undertook an independent review of the critical buildings, and that's fantastic. But neither the fire chief nor I were apprised of the results of those critical infrastructure building results, which showed that the documentation wasn't there, the tests weren't done. All of this is relevant to the work that I was undertaking. So I found out in May. I knew they took place in April, so they were done in April. I found out in May what the results were after I had been making inquiries. I knew that they had been done, but even though the results had come in before I was apprised, I wasn't apprised of the results. Anyway, so I was concerned about some missing documentation, and we'll leave it at that. So this is just a summary slide of some of the challenges I've had, and I know we're pressed for time, Chair, so I'm just going to go on with that. And my third line of inquiry that we talked about was company searches, and I'll get to that when I go through the results, which is next. So my findings were in 6 areas. There was an audit trail missing. There was problems with the invoices. There's an authenticity issue with the contractor. The fire chief's investigation showed that there were issues. There's broader systemic issues that have to be addressed both at the city, potentially in the industry. And it's important to clarify the reporting of wrongdoing. So in her report, Dame Hackett in the Grenfell report. First of all, that fire is not the City of Toronto. We have different building codes here. It's not the same thing, but I can say that there were some systemic cultural things that I did find that reflected in the work I was doing. One of them is an audit trail, and it's a deep flaw. The system to identify all of our buildings, what needs to be done, and make sure that's done to the code is missing here, and so I noticed that within our report. So this, we already talked about the missing documentation was an issue, so there's a lack of proof for us to be able to show that we are in compliance with the code. The second area was the problem with their invoices. Management itself was saying they weren't accurate. There was, we found multiple areas where there were issues. Potentially overbilling, service orders were an issue. We found some duplicate charges, small dollar amount, important charges. Incorrect invoice dates, so basically the invoicing was an absolute mess. We found technicians who were apparently in 3 locations at the same time. We found duplicate signatures that we had analyzed by a forensic handwriting court qualified expert who verified these are not the signatures of our staff and they're not the signatures of the technician. It looks like they were copy and pasted onto this document. And actually, we contacted the technician, and the technician said that that is not his signature. We found situations where the documents showed that the firefighters weren't there, and in fact, the document said they couldn't get a signature because the firefighters weren't there. I would say at least 25% of the time we had no signature. 50% of the time we had 2 signatures, and another 25% of the time we had 1 signature, like the technician and not the customer. So something was missing in this process. We have staff who recognize when there are issues. Staff are recognizing they were a mess. These are from emails with the company that the invoicing was a mess, it was unacceptable, they're doing a terrible job, don't have accurate reports. Our staff recognize that there are problems, but it's that link to say enough is enough, this is important, let's stop it now and let's get on with the next contractor. That's missing. And understanding the rules, we can stop, especially in a public safety situation, we can stop and end a contract for convenience. And Rod Blake is here to speak to that if you need more information. Just following your gut. If you, in your own house, had money and you received invoicing and incorrect documentation and they were asking you for payment, you wouldn't pay. You just wouldn't pay. You'd want to make sure you got what you paid for, and it's our money. So the Ontario Fire Marshal talks about when you are hiring these companies, make sure there's an absence of repetitive problems. And there are lots of repetitive problems. This is an example, just a picture. These are actual service orders. There's pictures, they're sending in pictures of something that looks like a Staples book. Sometimes they have a service order, sometimes they write it up, it changes. And one of the, when you're looking for inconsistencies, that you need to look deeper and you're looking for fraud. A company that doesn't have itself together to make sure that it's consistent and methodical and controlled, and you're asking them to look after your life safety equipment, might be a problem. And when you're looking, it doesn't mean because it's messy that it is fraud. What it means is you look closer because they don't have it in control. They may not know if they're billing twice, so you have to just make sure that it's controlled. The invoicing changed quite a bit. These are only some invoices that we found. Changed colors, changed names, and we actually interviewed under oath the directing mind behind this company, and he said he just likes to design. He just likes to, and that might be a logical explanation. For me, there was too many issues. And then our staff knew that our inspection reports that we're relying on for legal purposes could be manipulated. In fact, the contract allows the reports to come in an Excel format, and they can be manipulated. And that as you can see, a manager is noticing it's an issue. But the next step is, let's fix that. And that part is missing. The final interview with management after everything, after trying to find the invoices for months, we didn't really look at the invoices that much in the beginning when you asked us to look at it, but now we're letting you know. It was easier just, if we couldn't find it, it looks like staff just passed them through for payment. And that is deeply concerning because we had to spend a lot of city money to hire forensic people. There's a risk here. That was a challenge. So I asked the supervisor, why did you not listen to the life safety supervisor? There's a life safety supervisor, a guy who really, it was his job. His title was the life safety supervisor. He would put up his hand time and time again. And I spoke with him, and he was happy because he raised it to management, and he thought management was dealing with it. I spoke with management, and they said he was persnickety. We treated what he said with a grain of salt. These are exact quotes from the manager. So then I asked, so did you follow up to make sure what he was raising was fixed? And the answer was no. So there are many levels of concern for me here. There's a lack of action. They've known all along there's been issues. Like this life safety supervisor said, it's not like they're painting the floor for us and they missed the corner. These systems matter. That's what he said to me. So, then the verification to confirm the work, it wasn't done. We've gone through that, and that was definitely a concern. So this is a timeline, and just to color code the times that issues were raised where things probably should have stopped. And it started back in 2011 when there were issues raised, there was warnings, it went into 2012, 2013. In fact, we stopped paying, this life safety supervisor stopped paying because he said this work was not being done. There are duplicates, there are issues, we can't show it. And he sued us for non-payment, and we settled. And he said, I didn't settle my invoices because he didn't get the full settlement because I wouldn't. So I'm just letting you know that this is important, that there's issues raised many times. The purple shows that we kept renewing the contracts, or we kept awarding contracts to some of these companies. Now granted, the city would not have known necessarily that York Fire morphed into a different company, but the guy you were dealing with didn't change, Ralph Ramad. He didn't change. So if you're having issues, but even if you take that out of the equation, if you're having issues with any company, and they're not providing supporting documentation, I would be calling Rod Blake. I'm giving you lots of work, Rod. I'd be calling Rod Blake. So the city kept awarding contracts, and then then what happened was they not only renewed the contract, then they raised it by $100,000, a full year's worth. And why that got raised is because the allegation was they were replacing more batteries than they needed to replace. So they were using up obviously more money. And so the contract money ran out, and they had to increase the money. And then the complaint came in, and even after the complaint came in, there's a fair wage audit, there were issues, and one of the people who was originally named, one of the groups that was originally named, and that would be Advanced Fire Detection, they were actually awarded a bid. What the challenging thing is, PMMD raised this issue to us. PMMD went back to check if performance was okay to facilities management, and went back to the managers to whom these issues were raised. But the management didn't say there was a performance problem. So all the steps that should have been done from the PMMD side appear to have been done. But the issue coming through, there was a breakdown in communication or something, but and it's more than one company. So I can tell you I've got another file underway of another company where they've been awarded work after significant issues like this have been raised by city staff. So another municipality stopped using this contractor. They had similar problems. I'm going to move along here. And the contracts were renewed. We talked about that. The authenticity of this company, they put themselves out as being a long-time leader since 1993. But they're not that old of a company. Like York Fire, by the time we awarded the first contract, was only in place 6 months. But what happened would be The company would get into difficulty with the city or another vendor. They don't have to be licensed, so they would simply form a new company and then continue. York Fire got into issues, they form another company. So by the time I sat down under oath with the guiding mind of these companies, he informed me he's forming another company, and he's combining two, and he's continuing, and I've spoken to his staff, and they've got 2 more underway. So it doesn't end with the file today. It doesn't end with this company. So there's a systemic thing that has to be fixed, and we just have to be on the alert more. The other issue around this is that look at the number of groups that are using this company that they're putting out, who are using this company. And I can tell you there's 3 of the municipalities here that are mentioned that, you know, I know that they've done work in these municipalities, so there's issues there. And the concerns, again, even with the life safety supervisor, we're given a gut feel for a reason. And if somebody thinks there's somebody fictitious and you can't get a hold of them over years, and they don't come to the table ever, and we don't have any documentation on them, we don't even check if they're real before we actually employ them, you know, we've got to start trusting your guts more. And he thought the person was fictitious. So, you know, again, with Dave Daniels, not only with Dave Williams, we couldn't meet him, and there's jokes about, you know, him being on his yacht sailing away because nobody could meet him. This slide is important because what happened was we did a lot of work before we sat down to interview this person under oath. And the way that we were able to get admissions on although we had the handwriting analysis, we got admissions on the fake people, was because he couldn't explain that Dave Daniels and he were president with the same company on the same day. And then he had to admit, well, he was real because he was sitting in front of me, but Dave Daniels was not real. And neither was Dave Williams, and neither was Jason Peters, and neither is Ray Caffey. There's a number of people who aren't real. These are the interactions with the city, and part of actually pulling it together to look at centrally is that every time, these are positions of convenience. So when they were dealing with Toronto Water, they would have one thing, they would change it, and I found that the staff were realizing there's so many different names, we can't keep track of them. Who are you dealing with? Stop the insanity, stop it. Stop and figure out who you should be dealing with, and if you're having a problem, get them in to talk about it and find out what their role is. So follow that gut feel, I guess is the best way to put it. These are the people you'll see. Dave Daniels and Dave Williams have the same face. What was disturbing to me was not, and we had this discussion with this person, Ahmad, it wasn't simply just they had the face, but the descriptions would result in somebody putting confidence in Lisette Daniels to do their fire safety plan because they do it for municipalities in the GTA. And they would put you know, confidence in a fire safety engineer. I mean, that's who I would want doing my work too. And so this was absolutely disturbing for me. So we mapped out the companies, and you'll see Dave Daniels and Dave Williams, we put the same face on them, but everybody who's red is fake that we know of. We just found out Ray Caffey appears to be red. It appears to be fake. So for every gray box, that's a company, and there's more forming. And the buildings are simply the addresses. So for example, the yellow buildings, that address is used for York Fire, Advanced Fire Control, and a numbered company. And you know, purple is, so when you're looking at a potential fraud, it's very easy to change a name. It's harder to change a building. And so when you start to see this frequency, you start to, you know, pay attention. The other thing is where they are. I mean, the black building is actually, it's actually a mosque. It's actually a religious place of worship. And he is using that address for a registered head office. It's a registered company address. That doesn't make sense to me. You know, you wouldn't have it in any other, you know, organization. So that's challenging. And the person behind this at the center is Ralph Ahmad. He goes by Ralph Aran. So there's multiple challenges. And the reason this is important is because when the fire department goes out to do their work under the provincial regulations, and it's going to lay a charge, it has 6 months from the date that the work was done, not from the date they discover it. And to go through this level of analysis to figure out who's who so that it can lay the proper charge is very challenging. We found it challenging. because it was, it took a lot of work. So definitely they would find it challenging. So absolutely, we've made a recommendation that the city work with, the city support the fire chief and working with the fire marshal to extend that time. So when they discover it, they have at least 6 months, that's better, or a year to be able to put things together, to lay proper charges. Because I can say the amount of admissions and the things I've seen from this company, from other buildings that he was talking about, is deeply concerning, but out of time. And so, that's a challenge. And there's, in my report, there's a reference, there's a legend that you can look at. The handwriting analysis, we found at least 3 that were the same on 3 different bids. Advanced detection, the person on advanced detection, which is the bottom one, the blue one, we've contacted that person. They did not sign this document, but before we knew that, just looking at the handwriting, to me, I don't know what kind of eye I have, but I look at this handwriting, and to me it looks like the same handwriting at the beginning and at the end, and so I sent them to a forensic analysis. And the reason I needed to do that, because at that time I was bringing the person in and I wanted to know whether they were in fact fake people or not. And the warning signs for fraud, it's all here. Poor performance, these are all warning signs, indicators, forged signatures, staff raising concerns, messy invoicing. But to prove fraud is a different matter. To find the documents, you have to be able to show there's no reasonable doubt that this can be happening. The guy can just be a messy operator, right? Fraud is something different. Our staff are telling me, we have made sure the service was done, we have the documentation, and so now we don't have the documentation? The contractor, he has his systems, and it was a mess over there. We contacted the employees. So based on the totality of the evidence, my view is this is definitely high risk for fraud. Can the police prove it? We have been in contact with them throughout this file. They had been aware of it for many different reasons, and it's their job to determine whether there's fraud here or not, and that they can prove it and lay charges, because they have to be able to have the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. If we had everything together and we had strong witnesses being able to say we never received that service, we're in a good shape. The fire chief, in his view, the deputy fire chief and the fire chief, in his view of the deputy fire chief, for him, these companies going in, they have the public's trust, and it's a breach of trust in his view, and I'll just leave that there. But there are challenges when he has time constraints, which we talked about, and there's legislative change needed. The systemic issues, I'll go to those, and then we'll be finished. The city inspection results didn't come back well. He selected about 12 buildings, and this is an example. So in a building, there might be non-recording of information. There might be things not properly filled out. There might be things missing. This is an actual result of an inspection report, and you'll see a number of companies on the side. And one building can have 6 different groups doing inspections, and the challenge with that is how can facilities actually manage for each building, and it's probably got 2,000 buildings, 6 different contractors coming in doing all of these different tests. It's not easy, but there's probably a better way we can do it, and there's a smarter way we can do it. Here's another result of an inspection. And again, this is information that wasn't provided. So this just gives you a flavor of a portion of 2 inspections. We have 12. And a credit to the city, they went right out and they got an inspection of their critical buildings. And their critical buildings, the red shows either the paperwork wasn't in place, or the test wasn't complete, or it wasn't done. So this definitely is a concern. And it's relevant because for me it shows it's not a situation with one contractor. It's a situation that we might need to do things differently. We need to transform some things here. There's opportunities for improvement, absolutely. So getting this information is important. My challenge was I didn't receive this until I think it was May 25th. The work was done in February, March timeframe, maybe March, April, but it was concerning to me that this is absolutely relevant, and it was a result of the work that I was undertaking that this was done, and so it was relevant to come back to me. The systemic issues, again, we mentioned that not treating the building as a whole system. So things work as a system. You can have a kitchen extinguishing system that's attached to the fire alarm. So when the extinguisher goes off, the fire alarm rings, and everybody who's in that building, it can be a community center, it can be the kitchen downstairs, will know to leave the building. You would have two companies in looking at the two pieces and not coming together, and what happens is it's not in compliance. There's a decentralized, siloed approach across the city. We had Toronto Parks, we had Parks, Water, and we had the facilities all contracting with this company, many having problems with this company. The right hand's not talking to the left hand. That's one issue, but the decentralization of the management of the buildings across the city, the 2,000 buildings, is another issue. I think up until this point, facilities management was really looking at about 200 of the 2,000. If you own the building, you are accountable. That's it. So we need to get our system together across the board. Not standardizing inspection sheets. This is something I have to recognize the Canadian Fire Alarm Association. You know, they pointed out that the inspection sheets are not standardized and really a part of the code, and they probably should be. And the Toronto Fire Service identified that their old standards were being used in the inspections, and our contracts contained old standards. That's a concern. So standardizing the inspection sheets so everybody knows what they're playing to make sure the right things are done, and then making sure they're completed properly is important. Centralized database. We have some contractors that are operating inappropriately. We have 2,000 buildings. If we want to identify who's doing the work in which buildings, it becomes problematic. We don't have, you have to go to each of those buildings. You can't centrally look at the documents if you can find them. There's a challenge. So that's a problem. The complaint process. Many people knew about this contractor or had issues with this contractor, and nobody really wanted to talk about it because of privacy concerns. There has to be a mechanism to be able to raise a problem. This contractor's not only working for the cities and the municipality, it's working in hospitals under its own, it's working in schools. I've sent multiple bids on schools to the police, to the fire, so that they would know where this contractor is working. So to have a centralized complaint process at the city, but we're recommending at a provincial level, if you have a bad actor, that they can know who to notify. Because through this complaint, I'm notifying the deputy fire chief, who's notifying on a provincial building the province, and I'm notifying my counterpart. There has to be a better way, because if this is important, it has to have a focus. And the last thing is clarifying roles and responsibility. Again, Dame Hackett in the Grenfell report mentioned roles and responsibilities. Everybody's relying on everybody else. So I'm relying on the guy who comes in because he's the specialist. Well, guess what? He's not the specialist, and he's not accountable. And do you know what this contractor said to me? The last thing before he left the room? He said, I come in, I do my job, nobody died, I left. It's not my responsibility. So this is an example of the six contractors coming in, various companies. This is York Fire. When they come in, they have access to our buildings. I have emails of people given keypads, access codes, keys to the city, various city buildings. As long as you know who it is, I'll pass the keys to Elaine, because I know Elaine, I know her background, I know what she does. So we want to make sure we know who's in our buildings. We want to make sure we know who's formed. I saw an email where a city employee said, there's two different companies that come in, or there's different people that come in to do the work for York Fire. We presume they're the same company. What? Really? I mean, the technicians themselves said that they would be changing T-shirts. One tech, I spoke to more than one, said 3 times a day. He would go in, there's days, not every day, but he would change. He would be York Fire one time, and he'd go into another one, and he would be Advanced Fire Detection, he'd go into another one, he'd be somebody else. This website, you can't see it, but the whole thing is trusting your vendor, and they put out nothing but trust, and they have beautiful people there, and you would want to trust them, but you have to really go look behind the company. Potential performance issues. It's not just this one vendor or a series of companies. There are other vendors. There's many vendors who are good. Not all vendors are bad. But there are vendors who we, the city, are struggling with. It's time to stop that. The amount of money spent trying to track these people and to make sure they're doing their job, it's not worth it. The risk is not worth it. So we need to be more stringent on that aspect and stop awarding multi-million-dollar contracts year over year. Poorly worded RFQs. It starts in the beginning. The RFQ has to make sure that the right standards are there. We didn't have the right standards in the RFQ. It provides or the RFQ is not clear. There could be misinterpretation. So making sure we understand it as a city and making sure the right information gets in there is important. The lowest bid. So I know we do have the opportunity to say we can look at past performance. The problem is they didn't. We didn't look at it. PMMD was questioning the past performance. The past performance didn't come into the decision. And these people would bid like 50% below somebody else. You've got to ask the question. You get what you pay for, and what are you paying for? And potential wrongdoing. This was a concern for me. I'll just, of course, I know the city gets it. And there was a little, I guess, maybe a misunderstanding. I don't know what it was. But if somebody comes to me and they say there's an issue with public money, and it's a vendor causing the issue or the potential fraud, it has to be reported to me. It should be reported to me because I can determine whether it's management involved or the vendor or somebody else, and that's really important. Because otherwise, if this didn't come to me because somebody was making a decision that it didn't really belong with me or the other vendors that the deputy fire chief reported to senior management, if that didn't come to me, we wouldn't be looking to this degree, and those vendors would be continuing to do what they do. So it has to get to somebody, and I'll take responsibility to make sure the right follow-up is done. And the fraud and wrongdoing for everybody who's not clear, it includes allegations of fraud, it includes mismanagement of city resources and breach of public trust. So even though it's a vendor, there is an aspect of mismanagement of city resources. Our staff have to verify that the work was done. Our staff has to have a seamless end-to-end system to verify these systems are in place. Our staff has to make sure that the work is complete and that the vendors are doing what they need to do. That's mismanagement. To make a decision on whether something should or shouldn't come to me, you can't know that from an allegation. There's no way you can know that. I didn't know that. I was trusting management to take the first line look. You can only know that when you get in behind and you start to understand things. So out of an abundance of caution, make sure that you get it to me. And to summarize, we need to bring all city buildings into compliance. We need to clarify roles and increase training, not only for staff, but also for anybody who's dealing, a public servant. If you see something, say something. We need to develop protocols to conduct due diligence on companies that we trust our kids. Our kids are in daycare downstairs. So we have to make sure we know who's in our buildings. We have to make sure that we support the Toronto Fire Service when they work with the fire marshal to support any issues in this area, because it's not just us. It's the building down the street. And the last thing is make sure that staff concerns of any potential wrongdoing do come to us. Facilities management, I know, has been working hard in the last little while to pull together, and they're supportive of the recommendations. They accepted all recommendations, and I look forward to them sharing with you what they're going to do to implement this. And I just got 2 slides left. We talked about the UK Commission into the review of buildings. They found 3 things: ignorance, indifference, and a lack of clear responsibilities. I saw those themes here. It's a different situation because we have a different building code here, but we still have to be partners. And Chief Pegg, and I'll end on this, he says fire safety is always very much a team effort, and it's very much a partnership with us, the owners of the city. So we need to do our share, and I think FM is on board to do that.
Thank you very much. I know that we also have a presentation from Facilities Management. I welcome them to the podium at the end of the room.
We're looking for it. So I'm going to start. I think you have the presentation in front of you. There are copies, I'm assuming. So we'll start until we get this loaded, because we're just going to have to, because I know we're short of time, so we'll do that right now. So thank you very much. My name is Josie Sholey, the Deputy City Manager for Internal Corporate Services. And on my left, I have Sunil Sharma, General Manager of Facilities Management, and on my right, Marco Coco, who actually works on the business management side for the Internal Corporate Services. So first I want to thank the Auditor General for her support, her work with us, and we very much appreciate it, and also the Fire Services Organization working with us throughout this process too. So I want to thank Jim and Matt too for that work. I wanted to say the first thing is important here. We do take this very seriously, and I wanted to make sure that we actually clarify that here. It's important to us from an overall organization perspective. We do have pockets that we'll talk a little bit about that will work and obviously to bring this to a different level of performance. But I do want to make sure that facilities management does take it seriously as an organization overall. We have taken the Auditor General's recommendations. We've actually put management responses to them. We have acted on them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done so far. I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to continue doing and working from a city-wide, not just a facilities management division perspective. And I will also talk, and it will be focused on compliance process tools as well as education and training. So the second page, which would be your, I guess it would be page 3 on your, it's taking action on fire and life safety, FLS compliance on FM managed buildings. What I want to do right now is I want to focus on FM itself at this point in time. Facilities Management Division, it was important when Fire Services went to do the inspection and the review. It was really an audit of the overall 12 buildings, and about 7 of them Facilities Management actually manages, and the other 5 are across the city. So that was important for us to understand the information there. What we also understood that there was documentation. There was a lot of limitation around documentation, and we needed to understand that. So what we took upon ourselves about March timeframe of 2018, we actually hired a company called ARC. ARC is a company that actually does a lot of, they do a service around audits, in particular around your actual information you're reporting. So we hired them, and we asked them to look at 19 buildings. And these are the critical buildings, and would be building like this one. There would be all the civic centers. It would look at some of the police buildings. It would also look at some of the other buildings across, like Union Station, St. Lawrence Market, and other ones. So we asked them to do that. And what came out of it was a review of the, what came out was your buildings are safe, but your documentation is not where it should be, and there's a limitation. So what they did tell us was that ARC actually came back and said that we had about 70% to 75% of our documentation on file on-prem, and on-prem may be on an actual system that people actually access versus actually just in the actual building itself. And they also told us that about 20 to 30% we had to actually go look for. Now, I would say at this point in time, we only have 2 buildings that have 2 deficiencies. That's what we would call some of the documentation. None of these, the documentation is about 10 systems. 6 of them are major systems, 4 of them are what I call key systems, but not as major. We looked across all the systems with ARC, and ARC gave us that review. I actually spoke to the ARC owner in the last little while, and I wanted to understand from the ARC owner as to what her view was around our organization. What she said, the owner actually said, was that we actually had we actually had a really good approach around the way we actually have safe buildings, which is really critical for us to understand. But our documentation needed to be obviously looked at and centralized in a different way. She was very positive in the way some of the buildings were being managed in pockets within the FM structure. So I wanted to also state that as a group. She did make it very clear that one of the things that was really important was centralization of information, and that rather than being specific to a group and being in a specific building, it should be centralized overall. So what I want to say right now is what we're going to bring ARC back after we've done all of this work, bringing all the documentation together, and we're asking them to review this one more time. So that is what the next step is. This is a very key step for us at this point in time. The other thing that facilities is working on too, and it will be working on it from a citywide perspective, is we're actually going to review compliance overall on our 250 buildings. So we're actually going to be looking, we've asked everybody to actually give us the information around reporting, because it's important for all the systems. There's a report that is required at year end, so you test, you inspect, and then there's a report that comes in for the systems, and then you get compliance, right? And then at the same time you get certification. So that's what we're asking for all our buildings to come back to. And then what we're doing with this particular initiative, we're actually adding it to the bigger task force, which I'll talk about from a city overall perspective. The second last two bullets, one is really around training and making sure our staff understand the importance of obviously fire and life safety. And we've trained about 94% of our staff. We also had the Deputy Chief, Jim Jessup, come out to our group, and they actually did a presentation with the group. We'll continue working with fire services on that, and also we're going to be working with our vendors so they understand what the requirements are too from an organizational perspective. And then the last thing is around tools. We have started the centralization of the 19 buildings from a central repository perspective. We will continue doing that across the board. And it really is a shared drive, and it's making sure that we have the quality management around this. So that is the requirement. So that is really what we're doing from a facilities perspective, some of the key actions on the 19 buildings, and then actually aligning this to the bigger citywide review that we're working through. We're going to page 5, thank you. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing from a citywide perspective. In the back, you will see it's an appendix right now. There is an appendix that talks about how many buildings we have or how many properties. The appendix actually says that we, at the end of the day, as a group, we have about 1,859 buildings from a division perspective, from a city proper. We have about 643 for agencies and corporations outside of TCHC, and facilities has about 270. What we're going to be doing is we're creating a task force. We actually have created it. We've actually put some folks, and we're going to work with compliant groups that actually do compliance, whether it's water or other groups within the organization. And what we're going to be doing right now is actually looking for compliance. So we actually already have asked all the divisions, agencies, and corps from a city perspective is to actually report to us, and we actually gave them something to report back to us on their compliancy around the 10 systems. They're reporting whether they have the reports in-house, meaning on-prem, or where they have them. We wanted to make sure that they had all of the reports that would be required if we actually did an audit on them. So at this point in time, we have about 60% of the information at this point, and what we're seeing from the information is the key life systems are all actually reported, and it looks very good. And also some of the other systems are actually being reported, and what divisions and agencies and corps are saying, they do have the information. What we also have seen is that there is some documentation limitations on a couple of areas, and I would say that would be less than 10%, and we've got probably 60% back already, and we're talking about a lot of buildings at this point in time. But what we are going to do is, based on the information that we have received, is that we're going to be working with fire services, and we're going to be doing a national review around the risk and what buildings we want to actually look at based on the information that we've received. We are going to be taking corrective actions, and that's one of the bullets that's really important around some of the high-risk buildings based on the information that we have received. And then we're going to get a third-party review to go out there and actually validate what we've got. So we're not going to do 2,500 buildings per se, but we're going to be looking at types of buildings, certain vendors, and the management of the buildings across the organization so we can get a good sample. And it could be up to 200 buildings per se that we're going to be looking at as a city and working with fire services and the agencies, corps, and divisions. But what we're seeing right now is that a lot of the reporting is being done from the information that we have received. We are also going to develop a governance process. I think the AG spoke about that, from just an overall process of accountability and who's doing what, and the process in which we want to look at that across the city, not just from an FM perspective, but across. And we're going to be developing certain processes and tools. One of the things that actually when I spoke to our audit organization this morning and before, is that it was really important to understand how we actually do procurement, whether it's an RFQ and RFP, that we consolidate some of the way in which we do procurement around having one audit being done or one inspection testing being done in one building by one particular vendor versus 6 or 7 vendors, which some of us have that in our buildings, and making sure that we actually have a good contract management approach around the system, and making sure to what the AG was referring to is around the three-way match, and making sure that you have you put an order in, you actually have the actual report, and you also have the goods receipt, and you have the invoice, and you match that. That's really important overall. One of the things that we have put in place is the PM system within the facility side, which is a preventive management system that actually activates and says your actual requirement to do inspection and reporting is this month or that month. So we're going to actually look at that across the organization and see what other groups are doing. The other thing I would say, too, is we are going to be reporting back to the city manager on a regular basis. We'll be coming back to council in Q1 with the status of all the buildings that I referred to from the information that we gather and the inspections and the due diligence that we're doing also. The other page, which will be page 6, is taking action on fire. It's really about citywide action. This is around the duty and obligation of staff, and I think you can read that on your own, the requirement, and the city manager will be issuing a communication. She has actually spoken to the division heads across the city already in the last little while to make sure that people understand that requirement. The other page, which is the one with the chart here, it kind of just talks about timelines we're dealing with. The first timeline is building this inventory that I referred to from a citywide perspective on the 2,500 buildings. And then it talks about the actual compliance coordination plan that we're working through across, looking at the information, looking at what we're getting from the groups and prioritizing it based on size, vendor, and management. And then getting a third-party review being done here and working with fire services around that. And then taking corrective action around the deficiencies, whether it's, and most of the stuff is documentation that we've seen on the FM side, and then what we will do also is assist that across the board. And then obviously the important part here too is making sure, and it's really the green section there too, is really around processes and tools and practices from a city perspective, and making sure that we build that out. This task force will be reporting directly to me. And it will, we will actually start it up. We actually started having that discussion already, and we will, like I said, work with the groups to actually increase that across the board so we can get the feedback from all the organizations. And as you see in the bottom here, we'll continue doing education and training and development across the organization. I don't think that there's anything else that I would say at this point in time. I just want to demonstrate that we have taken action from a facilities management perspective, even from a citywide perspective, and being very proactive in trying to get at this. And the results that we're seeing are very important to note. There is no building safety issue that we have seen from the information across the organization at this point in time. There are some documentation issues that we need to work through, and I think that from what I've seen so far and the work that we'll get more information in the next little while, is that we have a very willing organization to work through this and make sure that this happens. So thank you for your time. And thank you again to the AG and her staff.
Thank you for the presentation. With that, it's now time for questions. The first person on the list I have is Councillor Ford.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I once again would like to thank the Auditor General for a very thorough report. But this is absolutely infuriating to sit here and see this. I guess the first question I have for staff, I know it was mentioned, but to be very clear, is the fire code up to date in all of our city-owned, operated facilities?
So, through the chair, Councillor, the fire code, from the information that we've received, we would say it is at this point in time, based on the information we received. We're still working through our deficiencies, which is what I referred to earlier. And as we get more information, we'll have a better understanding in the next little while. Because we actually have asked all the divisions, corps, and agencies to give us this information of what we know so far.
So what you've heard back, it's all up to date, but you haven't heard from everyone.
I haven't heard from everybody. We are getting more information by the time we get back to council, to tell you the truth. But what we have done on the facilities management side, working with the team on the 19 buildings that I referred to, we have compliance we have compliance. We're working with a couple of deficiencies. On the other 250 that you were asking about, we have seen in our data already outlines that we have a lot of the documentation. We do not have anything here of great concern at this point in time. I just wanted to be very honest, we're still working through this. At this point, we are to compliancy around the information we have.
So we have put resources right now, today, working on this issue.
We have FM resources at this point in time. We also have resources across the city-wide looking at this point in time. And we're receiving information, whether it's from TTC or whether it's from TPA or whether it's from other corps and agencies to actually give us the information as to where we stand. The important part to note, Councillor, is that we're receiving the information. The reports are there. They've done their annuals, which is really critical here on the systems. And what we'll be doing as part of the review going forward is we're going to be doing sampling of all those buildings, whether it's a specific vendor type or a specific management type, and looking to make sure that the audit trail is there to make sure the compliance is there. So we have to do that. That's the next step.
Madam Auditor?
Another question for you, Mr.
Councillor Ford, I think the auditor wanted to add a piece to that, if that's okay.
I can say at this point in time, for what I know, I don't believe that everything is in compliance. It might be. I think perhaps Deputy Chief Jessup may be best to speak to this, but from the documents I have, I can see that at least when I was doing my work, there are fire alarm inspections that weren't completed. There was information that wasn't completed. There was master fire plans in major city critical infrastructure buildings that were not in place. So, Deputy Fire Chief, if you can just, from what you know, are all city buildings in compliance with the fire code?
So, thank you. Through the chair, what I can confirm today is the 12 buildings that Toronto Fire Service had inspected, the violations have been corrected. We've been working through that with facilities management, but I cannot sit here today, Councillor, to your question and issue a blanket statement that every building that the city owns is compliant with the fire code, because I just don't know that.
So if I may, Councillor, that is the work that we will be going through. As what I was referring to is what we know now, and we'll be working through that, and we will come back. But what we've seen so far, there was no. One of the things that we wanted to make sure is the reporting on life systems and making sure people are actually doing the work, and that is absolutely what we're seeing right now for the information we've received from the groups.
Okay. I have many questions, but my second question is charges have been laid, but the last part of this in the documentation on the Auditor General's report on page 50, the last part of the timeline is that this company was awarded a bid. Are they still in operation? Is this fraud ring still happening? Are there city contracts currently right now that have not been verified that they are legit?
So, through the chair, as of July the 2017, we no longer use this contractor citywide.
Yeah, so can I clarify? That's correct for York Fire.
Right.
But the other company, Advanced Fire Detection Technologies, which was also part of the complaint in 2017, it won the bid award, and because of the fire charges that had gone out, the contract wasn't extended. So the charges went out May 31st, and the contract was due to go, I think, June 1st, and that didn't happen.
And we stopped that.
We stopped that. But so the company continued. It still went through the city systems. PMMD said, is there any performance issues with advanced detection technologies, no issues, and that's when the bid was awarded. So for clarity, it's still in the system, but technically they don't have a contract with the city right now. Those companies are still in operation though, and they're just not working with the city.
So I just want to make clear, they are not performing work for the city.
I do have more.
Yep, so Councillor Ford, what I'd like to do is just
A second.
rotate through the committee. With the committee's consent, I'd like to be able to offer Councillor Ford a second round of questions if we're okay. I think so.
Let's go through the committee and then
If we can do a
come back,
rotation
maybe
and then we'll
questions
come
we can
back, that
answer.
would be great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next was Councillor Matlow.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I heard a lot, and with all due respect, Josie, I heard a lot of how we're doing things well now and all the good things we're doing across the city. But what I'm upset about, frankly, is that I did not hear once in that presentation. Well, staff did say that they take this seriously. I didn't see it demonstrated in the response. I did not hear once what steps are being taken to hold management staff to account for this 3-alarm screw-up. What steps have been taken to ensure that this cannot happen again with those individuals? Have people been fired? Have people been taken to task? What has happened? I'm looking at evidence of when my family and I go out and we look for a contractor to do something in our home or what have you. We go into HomeStars, we ask for references, we talk to friends, like if I went to this website, which I can't even find anymore, for York Fire, for example, and I see these such obvious stock photos with bizarre grammatical effects, everybody looking like a Ken or Barbie doll, with various names. And like I wouldn't have hired them in the first place, never mind then when somebody actually tried to blow the whistle, not only was that effort stunted, they weren't taken seriously, no action. Where's the accountability?
So I'll just jump in before we go with the answers, just to remind that there's potentially in-camera discussion with this. And if necessary,
I'm not asking for names right now. I'm just
if
saying
necessary,
what
we can
actions
do that. But I would ask that management please go ahead and answer, but be mindful of that requirement.
So it's a fair question. Thank you for the question. And I do take this very seriously. This is very important for us to actually manage this. So I would say two things before we would go in camera in this discussion. We actually, outside of actually doing the training and development that we talked about, we have actually done an organizational change based on the Auditor General's recommendations, and we can take that in camera.
Okay, that's good to know. Please understand, in the response that I heard and what I read, there was no direct comment on accountability and direct accountability for individuals involved in these significant screw-ups that affect not only tax dollars, but potentially people's lives. When Councillor Ford asked staff, through you, Chair, are all the buildings up to code as we understand? The initial response, perhaps it may be out of context, the initial response was yes, but there's more work being done, rather than, candidly, we don't know. Why?
So can I just, I was talking about the FM because I've been doing a lot of work on the FM side, but on the bigger discussion, I actually, that's the work I'm working through. So
the answer is we don't know.
We don't have that at this point in time, no. That's why we're working through this.
So I would hope that through you, Chair, staff understand that the way to gain, I would submit on our behalf, the confidence of this committee and the confidence of council that substantive action is being taken, is to not just say that this is being taken seriously, but demonstrate to us, and I hope that's even further demonstrated during in-camera session, that genuine actions are being taken. Because I also want to make sure that individuals who work for us know that if they do make an effort to whistleblow, and we've had these conversations in the past audit committee meetings, that there is a safe place to go and that they will be taken seriously. And I don't see any evidence of that happening in this case.
So, Councillor Matlow, it's important to note we actually met with staff and we're very clear with them. If they believe that there is any wrongdoing happening, they have to go directly, they should go right to the Auditor General. They do not have to go through other groups. They should be able to do that. So we've actually, that was on the FM side. I want to be really clear. We've got two.
Sometimes they're going to go to their manager. That's their direct boss. That's who they know.
But let's just, if the manager is not actually moving that forward, we are asking them to actually go to the next level and until it actually gets dealt with.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Councillor Hart, you're next on the list.
Picking up on what the AG said, this matter is already being dealt with by Toronto Fire, which is terrific. And from what the AG said, I understand Toronto Police is taking a look at it. So that's eliminated a whole bunch of my questions. I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully the vendor will get what's coming to him. On page 6 of the report, you reference the AG's report once again, my usual stance on these things of 2005. And a lot of the things that have occurred in this would have been addressed if the recommendations back in 2005 had been followed up. But I'll skip over that. On page 5 of your report, there's a comment in there that staff said there's a need to trust the vendor. Did that raise any red flags with you? Just that comment, trust the vendor.
To put things in context, we do have vendors in our buildings, and they're checking batteries and lights. They're obviously all over the building, so there's a certain amount of trust that has to be placed in any vendor that works with people. I think what was surprising to me was the lack of due diligence before hiring the vendor when they come onto site to make sure that they do have their qualifications, it is the right person, that they are licensed to do. Many of the allegations were that the people doing the fire alarms testing, and I didn't find it in our buildings, but that they weren't licensed to the way they needed to be. So I think that pre-work and then diligence, I mean, if you think about this building and the city as your home, and somebody arrives at the door with a different shirt on, or if they arrive from a different company, or would you let them in to look at your electrical box? You wouldn't. You would not. And so I think it's really applying that. I think our staff are absolutely smart enough. I think they work very hard, and this is one aspect of a very big thing, but making sure the due diligence is done from the procurement side as they go through it, and obviously when they arrive on site is, I think, a lesson for all of us.
It seems to me that they were maybe too trusting on a bunch of levels. On page 37 of your report, you asked the manager why the concerns of the life safety supervisor were not followed up. And the comment back was he could be persnickety, which means he's maybe too fussy. I would want my life safety supervisor to be too fussy. I'd want that. I wonder why the manager would take that position. I think that would be a great quality as a life safety supervisor.
What I can say is that in every single circumstance, so because he had it in his emails, I spoke with him. I actually had the deputy fire chief go out and verify other vendors, and with comments that he had made, and he was 100% correct. And he wasn't persnickety, but what he said was wrong is actually wrong.
And on page 37, the manager also gave evidence that the issues were escalated to purchasing, and a meeting was held with purchasing, but when you drill down, no meeting was held. Did that raise any red flags?
It did, but we couldn't find any evidence from any side, even the manager themselves, that there was actually a meeting.
Okay. On page 39, on May the 21st, 2017, facility senior management became aware. Did they escalate it beyond themselves to maybe the city manager? I know they didn't go to you. Did they go beyond?
So they became aware. I believe there's people in the process. I think what was concerning for me about this aspect is that if somebody's saying that these systems are not being looked at, forget about the payment side, or forget about the overpayment. Somebody has to look at them. I think that was a concern for me. So when we went back, facilities management senior team, people that are here today confirmed to me that they didn't go back to check the health and safety even after it was reported, even in June 2017, to make sure it was done. So that was a concern for me.
On page 47, you noted that in May of 2018, the company was the successful bidder for shelter, housing, and support, but Toronto Fire laid charges in March. So I know it never went through, but how could they even be in the bid process when charges were laid 2 months prior?
I don't know, and that's definitely a breakdown in the process. But even around that, around those charges, like that aside, the history of issues with these vendors, it's there. It's just not getting, the check is not being done. When purchasing says, how's the performance? Everything good? It's not, the information's not going back, even though some managers know. Some managers it's not everybody, but some managers know, and it's not getting up. So that has to be fixed.
just on the same vein, purchasing was advised there were no performance issues during that process. That wasn't the manager advising.
Correct. It was the manager to whom the issues were reported.
It was the same person
Correct.
again?
But there was more than one manager copied on that email.
Okay. And on page 79, you noted that's your view that facilities management does not fully understand their accountabilities. I find that hard to believe when the managers are making 6 digits. They don't understand their accountabilities. I don't get that.
So I can't speak to that. I think one of the challenges for me is even just, and with respect, it's not just a documentation issue. It's not just a piece of paper missing in the file.
But you
that
drew
paper
you
is
drew
about the work that hasn't been done.
But that was your conclusion. They don't
Correct.
understand.
Correct. In fact, the actual, can I ask, the Toronto Fire Service inspectors who went out reported on more than one occasion that they didn't feel facilities management understood the reporting requirements for weekly, monthly, and yearly annual inspections. So it's not just my opinion, it's corroborated with, at that time. I think that the world is probably changing a bit, and I think that's good.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, then we'll rotate around through the committee again. I think my questions are for Deputy Chief Jessup. Sir, I wonder if you could explain to us a little bit about what you found in the 12 buildings that you reviewed or surveyed, or I guess did you actually inspect them? I think you worked in conjunction with facilities. What were the types of deficiencies? You mentioned they've been fixed, but what did you see out of the 12 buildings? How widespread were the issues?
Thank you for the question. And through the chair, just so I keep a clear line with our regulatory role. So when I directed the conduction of the 12 inspections in our investigation, it was not with facilities. That was under my independent or the chief's independent authority. So I just to be clear on that. So, Councillor, it's really important to note, and I will say, Toronto Fire Service has been very clear, regardless of whether you're in a private building or a city building. We will not leave if there's what we call an immediate threat to life. So we did not note any conditions inside any of the 12 buildings that we came across that would have deemed or met the threshold under the Fire Protection and Prevention Act as an immediate threat to life. So we didn't have to close a building. We didn't have to institute immediate fire watches. That being said, we did note numerous violations of the fire code. Ms. Scholey is correct. A significant portion of those were failing to keep records. But we also noted that the tests and inspections that were also being completed were not being completed as required by the fire code. So if I can give you an example. Smoke sensitivity testing is required on smoke detectors in the building. And when my staff spent the countless hours that they did going over the documentation and cross-referencing that documentation with the required standards, we noted, for example, that in numerous buildings, the smoke sensitivity tests were not being done, but they were recorded as being done. Or they were recorded as being done, and we found out they were not being done. We found similar issues, for example, with sprinkler systems, where there's a what they call a drip test and flushing of the systems, where it was recorded as being done, but we were able to demonstrate that it was not done. Or if it wasn't recorded, then it wasn't done and it is required to be done. So the violations were a vast array, but as I said, there was at no point in time an immediate risk to the public or to occupants of the buildings, or else we would have taken action, as we do across the city on a daily basis. But I would say, again, we noted issues with the documentation, as well as issues that the systems were not being tested by the vendor as required by law.
Okay, so if I understand this clearly, you're looking for an array of things when you conduct an inspection, and part of them are the records. So the fire inspector comes in and says, show me the book or show me the banker's box with all of the records. I think it's for 2 years, and you want to see that all this work has been done. But you went further than that, and you went to look to see if the actual work had been performed. So it's not just a matter of not keeping records, but tasks and jobs and requirements weren't actually performed.
Through the chair, that is correct.
Now, on balance, you looked at 12 buildings. I'm going to assume they were fairly complex or larger buildings. is what you found normal for what you would normally find with inspections all over the jurisdiction? Did these stand out as being problematic, or were they on par?
Through the chair, the documentation was problematic. We haven't experienced that kind of challenge over a specific building owner, certainly in a number of years. So absolutely the documentation was problematic. I will say, though, Councillor, that the level of work that Toronto Fire Service did on this file is not something that is normally done. And we normally, as do all fire services, have to take the word of vendors when they perform tests. If my staff was to go out and do this type of thorough work on every single building to every single level, candidly, I would, the fire chief would be coming forward with a massive budget request for additional staff. So we actually have to trust what people tell us. That being said, I can tell you, as soon as I brought this to the attention of Chief Pegg, he immediately, him and I have implemented additional processes internally where we are actually now starting to look very, very deeply over randomly selected buildings citywide because we now have discovered a huge problem. And as the auditor said, I can absolutely tell you it doesn't stop here. So the Toronto Fire Service investigation is ongoing. It's still an active investigation. But to answer your question, the level of detail that we had to get into in terms of the tests of the system, one of the examples that really stood out in my mind was on one of the reports, it said it was the same detector in the same location on the same 25th floor, heating duct, the same time 3 years in a row doesn't work. So that just doesn't make sense to us, and that allowed my staff to keep digging further and further and further. So to be fair, we have never spent this type of time analyzing line by line the work being done by vendors. It's something that we have, we need to take people at their word, and unfortunately we no longer do that anymore. So we have to balance that out with the resources, and we have, the chief has directed an implementation of additional measures. But I know I'm speaking a lot, but records were a huge problem, but the types of violations in terms of the systems we also found in the private sector.
Thank you. Councillor Ford for the second round of questions.
Please, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know there were a few questions about this particular manager that I understand in public and open session the answers are a little sensitive and we may have to go in camera. But what is in public is that manager's quotes that are in these documents saying, I think it was from the Auditor General, and I don't want to paraphrase, but it's pretty close to, I come to work, I leave, and no one died. That cannot be the standard we hold our managers to.
I just want to clarify, sorry, yes. Chair, that's actually the word of the vendor, not our staff. A big difference.
Sorry. So I will retract that question. So I guess this is more to our Toronto Fire Service. So the regulations on vendors working in fire life safety, that is an incredibly important job to have. And is there regulations and licensing from the Fire Marshal's office that regulate these companies?
Councillor, through the chair, the regulation of companies that test, inspect, maintain, and replace fire alarm systems is regulated under the Ontario Fire Code through the Office of the Fire Marshal. That historically has been the only life safety system that has been required to be regulated, despite numerous coroner's inquests making recommendations to the contrary. As recently as 2017, the provincial government mandated the licensing of sprinkler outfitters, so that is now new. But the rest of the life safety systems, from generators to commercial kitchen systems, emergency lighting, and so forth, there are no mandatory certifications or regulations.
So that could be part of the problem here as well.
Through the chair, that's correct, and the fire chief, through the recommendations, there was a recommendation that the chief would work immediately with the provincial government in sharing what we have learned and working with the Office of the Fire Marshal and the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Service to make sure that, we assist them in trying to close some of these loops, and I know the chief is absolutely prepared to do so.
Right. Okay. So with the charges being laid, so we have identified individuals. We know who they are. The Ontario Fire Marshal's Office knows who they are. And I'm kind of going through a broader scope of public safety here. I assume they have private contracts out there, which I think we need to be concerned about as well, and not just our city buildings. So has this individual been arrested? Is he able to continue doing this? So where does that stand?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. So through the chair, the charges, and I'm watching Ms. Chapman, the charges that have been sworn publicly against technicians, directors, and corporations were for violations of the fire code that Toronto Fire Service noted in a number of private buildings. Toronto Fire Service has an ongoing investigation over a number of buildings within the municipality right now that is ongoing. Toronto Fire Service has no authority whatsoever under the Fire Protection and Prevention Act to stop this individual, the technicians or the corporations from continuing to do work. At this point, the only tools the fire chief has is to swear in information, which we have done for violations of the Fire Protection Prevention Act. That is now with the carriage of Toronto prosecutions. But we do not have any authority whatsoever under any piece of legislation related to fire specific to stop this individual or the other individuals or companies from continuing to perform work.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the appropriate staff, have the police been made aware of this? I know there's been some conversation with the police. Do they have the ability to lay charges here, or does it solely rest with the Toronto Fire Service?
So, Councillor, through the chair, I can't comment on Toronto Police at this point. I can say, though, again, the authority to regulate and to govern specifically to the fire alarm industry falls under the jurisdiction of the Office of the Fire Marshal in the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services.
And Mr. Chair, my last question to staff, I don't know if this can be answered in public, but I will ask the question. Are we taking legal action against this individual or individuals?
I would, let's have that in camera, Councillor Ford.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Ford. I'll ask the other committee members in order, I guess. Councillor Matlow, did you have additional questions? We'll go on camera. Okay. Councillor Hart, did you have additional questions? No? Okay, so we do have a request for in camera. I'm going to ask just a couple other last follow-up questions that I think are public in nature. And set my own time here. But again, I think through to Deputy Chief Jessup, just about, can you give me some general observation about what you're seeing in the fire protection and inspections industry? Has the charges you've laid and even the work of the auditor created some tension, and I would even say some scarcity here, because it's a certain sized industry, and now these vendors, good vendors and vendors that have been identified as an issue, are now maybe changing the way that they work, or maybe aren't available right now. And if I was a landlord somewhere out in the 416, am I going to have a hard time getting an inspection?
So thank you through the chair. So Councillor, 100% it has sent shockwaves through the system. When Toronto Fire Service publicly announced the swearing of over 90 charges back in May related to just 3 buildings within the municipal boundary, the chief and I received calls from literally across the country and certainly from countless other municipalities. I know the work that the Auditor General has done on this has resulted in both the Chief and I receiving phone calls from municipalities across the country asking, how did you do this and what can we learn from you? And so certainly it has absolutely sent shockwaves through. The president of the Canadian Fire Alarm Association, the executive director, was here earlier. He actually wrote me an email stating that he fully supported the work of the Auditor General and actually fully supported the work that Toronto Fire Service continues to do. And I think really at the end of the day, the chief was very clear and I was very clear in May. To any of these, to be fair, there are very, very good vendors. So I think that's really important to say. These are a select few. We now know what to look for, and certainly the message to any vendor that is going to knowingly and willfully, fail to do their tests and inspections in accordance with the fire code. We are watching, and the chief has made it very clear. We will lay any charges that fall within reasonable and probable grounds, and we will absolutely make sure that we use every legal means necessary to stop this.
Now, you've been already clear in your answers on the implications to the fire service at large, not just related to the Toronto buildings, but I want to flip over to the DCM on this with respect to the tension that this is going to cause on your ability to deliver services. And I'll say it's twofold. The first is now you got to deal with trying to get vendors in to conduct inspections when probably everyone and their brother in the world is now trying to get inspections done. So you'll have that pressure, but you also have the obvious pressure of, councillors with questions about, well, what about the facilities in my ward, and the public questions about what's going on in our facilities, what do we know, how fast can we know it? I guess my basic question to you is, as a council, regardless of this auditor's report, what can we do to support you to get to those answers? Because the objective is to get everything into a compliant state, everything into a safe state, and deal with the pressures that this issue with this vendor has caused, not even withstanding what's in the Auditor General's report. Is it staff? Is it resources? What is it that you need?
So thank you for the question, Chair. I guess the key thing is we are going to actually request that we would actually sole source and get some work done here ASAP with some of the work that's required with some of these vendors, especially the auditing part that I wanted to do. And that would be looking at Councillor, the actual vendor, where the vendors are today. Some of them, we want to go look at the buildings and sampling. We want to go look at the management and the way they manage the buildings, as well as we want to look at the types of buildings, because they can differ, right? So that is something that we're going to be doing. The other thing that we are going to be doing, and that's relooking at the way in which we do this from an overall task force perspective, and that's something we were putting in place immediately, Councillor, and that is we are looking actually right now at looking at our budgets to be able to do that and put that focus 100% on that. And our job is to come back and give you guys a report as to how this is going. We'll come back at council to make sure, to Councillor Matlow's question that he had around the buildings, right? We're going to come back and tell him where we stand at that point in time based on the information we've received, and then we'll be coming back when council resumes again with where we're at overall with the buildings too.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Matlow, you have a motion to go on camera, so those that are visiting, we will require the room to clear. We'll take a 5-minute recess after the motion is placed. We will invite you back once the in-camera session is complete for an opportunity to speak and place motions. But I will thank you for your patience as we go through this process. Councillor Matlow.
Mr. Chair, I move that the Audit Committee recess its public session to meet in closed session to consider the following item: AU 13.11, raising the alarm, fraud investigation of a vendor providing life safety inspection services to the City of Toronto. The reasons for confidential information is the security of property belonging to the City or one of its agencies and corporations, personal matters about identifiable individuals, including City or local board employees, labor relations or employee negotiations, and receiving advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege.
All those in favor? That is carried. It's a 5-minute recess, and then we'll be in camera. All right, the Audit Committee has completed its closed session. Consideration of confidential information related to the following item, AU 13.11, raising the alarm, fraud investigation of a vendor providing life safety inspection services to the City of Toronto. The Audit Committee has issued confidential instructions to staff in the closed session. We will now proceed with the public debate on these items. We do have some speakers. I'm going to go first, though, and if I could ask the clerk to place a motion onto the screen. And what I'm going to do, for everyone's benefit, because it's lengthy, is just paraphrase it, followed by a brief comment. So item number 1 is to allow the Deputy City Manager the ability to negotiate and enter into a non-competitive agreement for $650,000 plus HST. Number 2 provides authorities to the Deputy City Manager, Corporate Services, to terminate contracts with vendors providing fire and life safety services for the conditions that are spelled out in here. Number 3 is the City Council direct the Deputy City Manager and Internal Corporate Services to complete the implementation of the recommendations from the 2005 Maintenance and Administrative Controls Review that we talked about earlier today. Number 4 is City Council increase the facilities real estate, environment, and energy complement by adding 5 temporary FTEs for 6 months for a life safety task force. Number 5 is City Council amend the 2018 facilities real estate, environment, and energy capital budget for that $661 million that was mentioned from a reserve fund. Number 6 is City Council direct the Fire Chief, Toronto Fire Services, to report through the 2019 budget process on any operational and financial implications of increasing the numbers of inspections that we talked about in our questions today. The Audit Committee will request the Deputy City Manager Internal Corporate Services to report directly to City Council at July 23rd meeting with the inventory of the fire code compliance information in city buildings, and to report the proposed order in which the audit of city buildings will be completed, such as by vendor or critical infrastructure. And the last is that the Audit Committee requests the Fire Chief, Toronto Fire Services, to report directly to City Council at its July 23rd, 2018 meeting, outlining the operational and financial implications of increasing the numbers of inspections by Toronto Fire Services associated with the pressure that is going to be generated by this issue. I want to take a quick moment to thank everyone involved with this. Of course, Chief Pegg and Deputy Chief Jessup, who has been deeply involved. The auditor has talked to me about a number of people that have assisted her and her team through this report, including the Canadian Fire Association and Peter Hanlon. I'd like to, of course, to thank the City Manager, Facilities Management, and Toronto Water for all of their work from the management's perspective on this audit. And, of course, to Madam Auditor General, Beverly Romeo Beeler, and her team, Elaine Au, Jerry Schobel, Heina Jaffrey, and Laura Wright. I will just make the brief comment of I was aghast when I read this audit. We've seen some incredibly powerful things cross this table, and I mentioned a few of them at the beginning of the meeting. Incredibly powerful observations that sometimes takes an outside view to recognize what's happening, but drives an enormous amount of change. You know, this is almost a pleasure to see an audit come across rather than a report of a death in a building or a fire or some other catastrophe where we would be looking at this in a different lens, finding the same issues. So thank goodness it was found now. But it is an extremely serious issue because of all the dimensions in this. Firstly, what we've learned of our vendor and the concerns that we've got, what we've learned about our internal processes. I can only guess on the amount of energy and effort that is going to be required by, for sure, our fire services to deal with this on a broad scale across the city, what other fire services are going through, what the Office of the Fire Marshal is going through, what vendors all over the place are going through, and the storm that this has created across the entire industry. I can only guess about the amount of work that our facilities staff are going to have to go through to correct this. Because of, I think it's 6,000 buildings that we've got, 2,000 buildings cited elsewhere in the report, and the amount of effort required. I think many people will have asked many questions about, you know, why, when, where, how did this happen? How do we stop this from happening? And I'm seeing a lot of answers, and I'm seeing a lot of work to be done, but one of the roles that I want to make sure that council does is support our public service, including the fire chief, and support our facilities folks to deal with this right away. And that's why my motions here contain some references to some authority and some authority to hire people. It concerns me that we're going to head on to a council break where we will not have the benefit of meetings, we will not have the benefit of the intervention or the ability to make changes as we would as elected officials. And so my goal with these motions is to really set things up for success over the next number of months and to see those reports back of changes. I really can't stress the urgency. I believe that this needs to be looked at. As far as I'm concerned, it needs to be tools down and all eyes onto this, because it really is about the life safety in our buildings. And more broadly than that, it's about public confidence in government, and I really think that's why a lot of us are here. I know I am. It's about making people feel good about and believe in their city government. And we have found a problem, but what I really want to see is the path forward to fix that and fix the confidence in the system. So with that, I hope you'll support these motions, and I thank everybody for their involvement. It is truly a serious matter, and I know that for me and for members of this committee, I think I can speak for them that we are taking it exceptionally seriously, and I know the mayor has too. So thank you very much. Councillor Matlow, I think I had you first to speak. Councillor Ford.
Okay, well, I want to thank the chair, and obviously I want to thank the AG for the work of you and your staff at uncovering and bringing this to our attention. And I also want to thank Joe Sischioli and are you, how would I refer to you, acting city manager still, or I don't even know what your title is anymore. But really, and the deputy chief and Lou and all of you who are, really trying to address this in a sincere way. I said earlier that I was concerned about the comments that I heard back through the staff presentation. I just want to make a point of saying, well, obviously I can't reveal what was discussed in camera. That after further discussion, I became far more convinced that my concern was more about the appearance rather than the substance of the actions that senior management are willing to take and are taking. And I just wanted to address that publicly, given the concerns that I raised earlier. As I said before, like this really is though like a 3-alarm screw up. Like it's like I've seen a lot of weird things come through this committee, as the chair said, and this is beyond weird. It is almost like one of those like weird Netflix shows where you can't believe this kind of mystery that's being put together, and fake names and fake even dates where companies were started and people coming back with different shirts and all that. Like it's absurd. Like if somebody actually wrote a script like that, they'd probably get laughed out the door because it just doesn't you couldn't believe it. Yet it happened. And the fact that this absurdity was then, by the city of Toronto, allowed to then turn into a contract where people got tax dollars and life safety was potentially put at risk, is beyond disbelief. And I just can't express it more. And I think we all feel the same way. Like it's just remarkable that this was even allowed to happen in the first place, let alone that it did happen. But I am confident that the system, as much as I'm upset at how broken it was, and in many respects continues to be, I'm also very confident the system works with the fact that we are now discussing this at a committee where it had to come to, and that we have an Auditor General that provided accountability to this and brought it to our attention, and then a staff response that recognizes the severity of this problem. So in many ways, it lends some cause for optimism that the system works, especially when it's most broken. But I guess I'll just conclude by saying, Councillor Ford earlier brought up some questions again in camera, so I can't reiterate them. But let's just say, to pun again, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that we address substantive concerns even when they are directly affecting our own buildings, because if it's happening there, we have to ask as public officials, all of us in this room, it might be happening elsewhere. And we need to support every effort to make sure that there's some way to ensure more accountability and reliability from the get-go before we get to a place like this, or any other organization or any other property owner in the province of Ontario finds themselves in this situation again. So I know that council will support us moving in that direction. Anyway, I just want to thank all of you involved in bringing this to our attention, and I look forward to I guess a further conversation at council.
Thank you. Councillor Ford?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I think both of my colleagues have, I couldn't say it better than them. I echo their comments. The one thing I do want to reiterate that has been said, and I'll say it again, to thank our Auditor General for another incredibly thorough report on, once again, and a very serious topic. This is something that, as the presentation was going through, I think I was sitting here just, aghast. Just I couldn't believe it. And it's something we need to take very seriously. Fire and life safety, whatever it may be, public safety is everyone's responsibility. And I think that's one of the biggest things that really is at the core that bothered me here, is that is everyone's responsibility. When we see an issue, no one should be turning away from it or brushing it off. It should be dealt with immediately. You look around the world, and there have been devastating incidents around lack of fire safety. And the possibility of that happening in one of our buildings is just unimaginable. So I absolutely support the motions Deputy Mayor Holliday put forward to really get on top of this. And I do have the utmost confidence in our senior city staff that this will happen, and absolutely the utmost confidence in our Toronto Fire Service, who do an incredible job day after day under the leadership of Chief Pegg and you, Deputy Chief Jessup. So this is something we take very seriously. I take very seriously. I will be speaking to this at council. I believe council will go through the same process we went through. So, but I know we're on the right track. So, thanks to all staff.
Thank you, Councillor Hart.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Matlow mentioned it was a little bit like a Netflix movie or Netflix show. I kind of agree, more like a Netflix horror show on a lot of levels. The good news out of this, though, is, Toronto Fire's involved. They've laid charges. I've got total confidence in them. The staff here, I have total confidence in them. It's the right staff to be dealing with this issue. I'm thrilled that Toronto Police is looking at it, and I hope they turn over every single stone. A lot of things happened in this report, but what concerns me the most is not really so much what happened, it's the way it was handled. And two things specifically, that the AG was only brought in at the very last minute, and lots of people touched this file and could have brought the AG in. And we have a recommendation for the city manager to go out and remind people about process, which I think is an unfortunate recommendation. I don't really think it's required. The people that knew about this were making 6-digit salaries. They don't need to be reminded. So I think that's a bit unfortunate. And the thing that is the most unfortunate, I think, in this, that really needs to be looked at, is the fact that staff repeatedly defended the vendor. And I can't understand why. That's my most concerning piece. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hart. So on the amending motion, all of those in favor?
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote. Clerk, do you want to do that, or want me to do that? So that's Councillor Ford, Councillor Matlow, Councillor Hart, and Councillor Holliday. There is a secondary motion, which is the motion to end debate that The committee confirmed instructions to staff in closed session in requesting the city manager and the city solicitor to report directly to council on July 23rd, 2018. All of those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. And finally, I believe it's item as amended. Councillor Ford wishes a recorded vote. So on the item as amended, Councillor Ford, Councillor Matlow, Councillor Hart, and Councillor Holliday. That's unanimous. That passes, and that is the last item. I thank everybody, and that would be meeting adjourned.
I have loved this committee. I
So
can't
have
tell you. I really, and working with all of you, it's been a
Well,
great
here,
pleasure.
drop the gavel.
Thank you.